The night split apart with alarms echoing across the city skyline. And inside the boardroom, Jonathan Hale said, "Who leaked this?" His voice was sharp, cold, and merciless. The narrator explained how the CEO with salt and pepper hair stood frozen as breaking news splashed his name across every glowing screen. Executives sat rigid, their faces pale in the red light flickering against the glass walls. Olivia Carter gripped her tablet as if it might shield her from the storm. David Mitchell avoided Jonathan's eyes, his hand trembling near his pen. Silence consumed the chamber until even the tick of the clock felt violent. Betrayal had stepped out from shadows and into the open. Jonathan's jaw clenched with fury, and in that moment he knew his empire was under attack from enemies closer than he ever imagined. The narrator described how silence pressed down like a storm cloud as Jonathan Hale said, "We are not victims, we are predators." His words cracked through the chamber, but doubt lingered in every eye. Olivia Carter whispered nervously to David Mitchell, her voice almost drowned by the ticking clock. Jonathan's gaze swept across them like a blade, searching for loyalty but finding only cracks. He inhaled deeply, his chest burning as he growled, "Find the leak?" The narrator explained how the executive sat frozen, unwilling to move, fear and guilt coiling through the room. The storm thundered outside, but the true war was unfolding within these walls. Betrayal now had a face, though Jonathan had yet to name it. The silence became a weapon, sharper than words, and every executive knew survival demanded treachery against someone else. The narrator explained how Jonathan Hale felt the weight of betrayal pressing against his chest like steel. His reflection stared back at him in the storm-streaked glass as he whispered, "If they think I'll break, they've miscalculated." Lightning cut the skyline, illuminating the chamber in violent bursts. David Mitchell said, "Sir, maybe we should call a press conference." Jonathan snapped his head around, his eyes cutting into the man. "No, we strike back, not explain," he said, his voice carrying the sharpness of a blade. Olivia Carter gripped her tablet tighter, her lips pressed thin as silence consumed the room again. The narrator revealed how Jonathan's pulse roared in his ears, his fury feeding on the storm outside. He knew in that moment his enemies were circling closer, and the betrayal was already inside his gates. The narrator revealed how Jonathan Hale stepped back to the head of the table, his gaze merciless. "Someone in this room chose war against me," he said, his voice echoing like thunder. Olivia Carter stammered, "Sir, you can't believe." But Jonathan cut her off with a snap of his hand. "Silence," he demanded, his eyes burning through her. David Mitchell lowered his gaze, sweat glistening at his temple. The storm outside grew louder, as if the sky itself judged the room. Jonathan's words fell heavy. "Prove your loyalty or fall with my enemies." The narrator explained how this was no negotiation but execution, dressed in corporate suits. The silence that followed was suffocating. Fear coiled like smoke across the boardroom, as each executive realized survival now demanded betrayal of another. The narrator described how the boardroom air thickened into suffocating silence. Jonathan Hale leaned forward, his knuckles pressing into the glossy table, his cold eyes sweeping across Olivia Carter and David Mitchell. David's hand shook as he tried to steady his pen. Jonathan said, "When predators smell fear, they strike." Olivia lowered her gaze, her lips pressed thin, while David swallowed hard, unable to mask his dread. Lightning flared, splashing the chamber in violent white. Jonathan whispered with venom, "If I fall, this company burns with me." The narrator explained how his words struck the room like a blade, forcing every executive to confront the reality that business had transformed into survival. Trust was dead. Loyalty fractured. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm within. And only ruthless cunning would decide who lived to see dawn. The narrator explained how Jonathan Hale entered the executive lounge the following morning, his eyes shadowed by a sleepless night. The storm outside had passed, but inside the tension had only sharpened. Olivia Carter greeted him softly. "We need a strategy, Jonathan." He ignored her tone and poured himself coffee, staring into the black liquid as though it could reveal answers. David Mitchell muttered from the corner, The board is restless and they want blood. Jonathan turned sharply, his voice cutting the air. Then let them choke on their fear. Silence followed, yet whispers of betrayal already floated between them. The narrator made clear that Jonathan's empire was no longer built on trust but on fragile alliances ready to splinter. Every ally could be an enemy, every smile a knife waiting to strike. The narrator described how Jonathan paced the hallways of his company, the clatter of his footsteps echoing like a war drum. Employees turned their eyes away, sensing the storm on his face. Olivia Carter hurried beside him, whispering, "The press is circling like vultures." Jonathan replied, "Good, let them circle. I'll feed them someone else." His words chilled her, yet she kept walking. David Mitchell followed a few steps behind, nervously checking his phone. The narrator explained how rumors had already spread like wildfire: who was the traitor, who had leaked the scandal, who would fall first. Jonathan's company pulsed with suspicion, every handshake filled with poison. He marched forward with fury, his mind already shaping the battlefield. The narrator revealed how Jonathan convened a sudden meeting in the strategy room, its walls lined with digital screens glowing red. He slammed a file onto the table and said, "This company bleeds because one of you opened the wound." Olivia Carter lowered her gaze, whispering, "You think it's one of us?" Jonathan's glare answered without words. David Mitchell shifted uneasily, sweat gathering at his collar. "We need unity, not accusations," David said, but Jonathan cut him off. "Unity is a fairy tale. Survival is the truth." The narrator explained how the air turned suffocating, every word another blade drawn. Jonathan's voice thundered, "From now on, loyalty will not be spoken, it will be proven." Fear consumed the room, and every executive felt the ground shaking beneath them. The narrator described how Jonathan retreated to his private office, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass. Olivia Carter entered cautiously, saying, "You can't lead by fear forever, Jonathan." He stood at the window, his reflection fractured by rain streaks. "Fear keeps them awake. Fear keeps them loyal," he replied coldly. Olivia stepped closer, voice trembling. "Fear breaks people, and broken people betray." Jonathan turned, his eyes like steel. "Then let them break. I'll build stronger soldiers from their ashes." The narrator revealed how her silence afterward spoke louder than protest. For the first time, she wondered if Jonathan was losing not only his company, but his soul. The storm inside him was darker than the one outside. The narrator explained how the board assembled that evening, their whispers like knives scraping marble. Jonathan entered, shoulders squared, face carved in fury. David Mitchell leaned toward another member, muttering, "He's losing control." Jonathan slammed his hand onto the table. "If anyone here thinks I am finished, stand and prove it." The chamber froze, silence sharper than thunder. Olivia Carter watched him with a mixture of fear and loyalty, her heart torn. The narrator revealed how Jonathan's voice cut deeper. "I will not fall. I will bury my enemies one by one, until nothing remains." His words echoed like a vow, his shadows stretching long against the cold glass wall. Everyone knew the war had begun, not against outsiders, but within. The narrator explained how Jonathan Hale entered the operations floor late at night, his shoes striking the marble like gunfire. Rows of employees pretended to focus on screens, yet fear rippled through the room. Olivia Carter hurried at his side, whispering, "Morale is collapsing. People believe someone is feeding information to the rivals." Jonathan stopped abruptly, his voice sharp. "They believe it because it's true." David Mitchell appeared from behind, clutching a folder, saying, "We're tightening access points." Jonathan turned on him, cold fury in his eyes. "Not fast enough. The spy is already here." The narrator revealed how silence fell heavier than the city lights outside, every face suddenly suspicious. Jonathan knew the walls of his empire had ears, and one voice among them was digging his grave. The narrator described how Jonathan gathered his closest circle in the war room, a chamber bathed in sterile white light. He spread documents across the table, pointing to financial leaks. "This information was fed directly to our enemies," he said. his voice edged with venom. Olivia Carter replied, "Then we must lock down everything." Jonathan shot back, "Lockdowns won't fix betrayal." David Mitchell shifted uneasily, muttering, "We can't accuse without proof." Jonathan's glare silenced him. "Proof will come when the traitor slips, and they will." The narrator explained how suspicion poisoned every glance, every nervous twitch. Jonathan no longer saw allies, he saw suspects. His empire had become a fortress at war with itself, and he was its commander on the brink of collapse. The narrator explained how Jonathan sat alone in his office, the city skyline flickering like broken glass behind him. He replayed every decision, every smile, every handshake, searching for cracks. Olivia Carter entered quietly, saying, "Jonathan, you're tearing yourself apart." He didn't look at her. "Better me than this company," he answered, his voice hoarse. She stepped closer, her voice soft. "But if you burn everyone, there will be nothing left to save." Jonathan turned finally, his eyes hollow with exhaustion yet burning with fury. "Then I'll rebuild it from the ashes," he said. The narrator revealed how Olivia's silence echoed the truth. Jonathan was no longer saving his empire, he was consuming it, piece by piece, in his war against invisible enemies. The narrator revealed how Jonathan convened a sudden midnight meeting, with only Olivia and David present. The boardroom glowed with stormy blue light. Jonathan said, "We're being hunted from within." Olivia whispered, "Then we must root them out carefully." Jonathan slammed his hand on the table, snarling, "Careful is what got us here." David Mitchell interjected, "If we make the wrong move, the entire company fractures." Jonathan leaned closer, his voice razor sharp. "It's already fractured. Now we decide who survives." The narrator explained how tension wound tighter, suspicion burning holes into the air. Jonathan's fury consumed him, but somewhere deep inside, fear gnawed. He was no longer certain whether the traitor sat outside this room, or across the table staring back at him. The narrator described how Jonathan stood at the edge of the rooftop terrace, the city sprawling below like a battlefield. Olivia Carter approached, her voice soft. "You don't have to fight alone." Jonathan's eyes remained locked on the skyline. "Alone is safer." David Mitchell appeared behind them, saying, "Isolation is dangerous, Jonathan. It blinds you." Jonathan turned slowly, his expression a mask of fury and sorrow. "What blinds me is betrayal, and it walks these halls." The narrator explained how thunder cracked overhead, the storm returning as if summoned by his rage. Jonathan's vow was etched into the night. He would crush the traitor, no matter who it was, even if it meant destroying everything he had built. The war within had begun. The narrator revealed how Jonathan Hale returned to the boardroom at dawn, exhaustion carved into his face but fire still burning in his eyes. Olivia Carter was already waiting, her voice calm. "We can still control this, Jonathan." He ignored her and set a folder on the table, filled with evidence of leaks and forged accounts. David Mitchell entered late, his tie loose, his expression uneasy. Jonathan's voice cut the silence. This betrayal was crafted from inside, not outside. Olivia's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. David muttered, "We need proof before we destroy trust completely." Jonathan leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Trust is already dead. What remains is survival." The narrator explained how the cracks that had haunted Jonathan now began to widen, revealing something darker beneath. The enemy was closer than he wanted to believe. The narrator described how Jonathan summoned a handful of trusted analysts, demanding they trace the leaks. Hours dragged, and then one of them whispered to him, "The trail doesn't lead outside, it loops back to the board." Jonathan's breath caught, his pulse hammering. He confronted Olivia Carter in private, his voice low. "Tell me it's not you." She looked him in the eyes, steady but wounded. "After all we've been through, you dare accuse me?" David Mitchell entered suddenly, catching the tension. "What's happening here?" Jonathan said sharply. "Betrayal lives here. I can smell it." The narrator explained how suspicion burned like acid, eroding every bond. Jonathan was no longer choosing allies. He was waiting for one of them to confess, or slip, under the crushing weight of fear. The narrator explained how Jonathan's world collapsed when the evidence finally pointed to David Mitchell. A report landed on his desk showing secret communications, coded transfers, and signatures that couldn't be denied. Jonathan stormed into David's office and slammed the papers onto his desk. "You sold me out," he growled. David's face drained of color, but his voice shook with defiance. "You made this company a cage, Jonathan. I only opened the door." Jonathan's voice thundered. "You betrayed me to vultures." Olivia Carter arrived in the doorway, frozen as the truth unfolded before her eyes. The narrator revealed how betrayal didn't just destroy Jonathan's trust. It shattered the fragile empire he had built, revealing the venom at its core. The narrator described how Jonathan dragged David Mitchell into the boardroom, the evidence displayed on the giant screens for all to see. Gasps echoed as the coded messages burned across the glass. Jonathan's voice was ice. "Here is your traitor." David's hands trembled as he tried to speak. "I did it for survival. You would have destroyed us all." Olivia Carter rose to her feet, her voice breaking. "David, how could you?" Jonathan's eyes were merciless as he declared, "He won't destroy us. I will destroy him." The narrator revealed how the betrayal tore the room into chaos, alliances fracturing like shattered glass. Jonathan was no longer hunting shadows. He had found his enemy, and now the war was open for all to see. The narrator explained how Jonathan dismissed the board and confronted David Mitchell alone. Rain hammered the glass walls as thunder shook the night. David whispered, "You turned loyalty into fear. That's why I betrayed you." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Fear kept us alive. You chose weakness." David's eyes glistened with defiance. "No, Jonathan. I chose freedom." Olivia Carter entered quietly, torn between them, her voice breaking. "Stop this before you destroy everything." Jonathan stepped closer, his words sharp as a blade. "This ends tonight." The narrator revealed how lightning flared, illuminating three figures bound by shattered loyalty. The betrayer had been unmasked, but the cost was already too great. The war was no longer about the company, it was about Jonathan's soul. The narrator revealed how Jonathan Hale called a secret midnight gathering with only Olivia Carter by his side. The rain had not stopped for days, as though the city itself reflected his fury. Jonathan said, "We strike them before they strike us." Olivia hesitated, whispering, "This isn't business anymore. It's war." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, his voice unflinching. "Then war is what they'll get." He spread files across the table, lists of rivals, investors, and weak links he would crush. Olivia stared at the papers, torn between loyalty and fear, realizing he was willing to burn everything to save himself. The narrator explained how Jonathan's descent was no longer quiet. He had chosen aggression, and the first moves of his ruthless campaign had begun. The narrator described how Jonathan summoned David Mitchell into a locked chamber, guards stationed outside. Jonathan held up incriminating contracts and said, "You built this trap, now you'll pay for it." David's face went pale as he whispered, "You can't run a company by fear." Jonathan leaned closer, his voice sharp. "Fear built empires. Yours ends tonight." Olivia stood in the corner, silent, her eyes filled with dread. David slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "You'll destroy yourself." Jonathan replied coldly, "Better me than to let a traitor live." The narrator explained how the room boiled with rage and despair, a clash of loyalty broken beyond repair. Jonathan was no longer a leader. He had become an executioner. The narrator explained how Jonathan unleashed his plan on the corporate battlefield. He orchestrated hostile takeovers, cutthroat deals, and planted stories that crushed his rivals. Olivia said, "This will ruin lives." Jonathan replied with steel in his voice, "Only those who stood against me." David Mitchell watched helplessly, his influence stripped, his power reduced to whispers. Jonathan's eyes burned as he signed order after order, dismantling allies who had turned into enemies. The narrator described how each move was precise, ruthless, and devastating, leaving scorched ground where thriving partnerships once stood. Jonathan had declared war not just on his betrayers, but on the very foundations of trust and loyalty. The narrator described how Jonathan confronted rival executives in a high-rise office, his presence filling the room like a storm. "Your time is over," he declared, throwing documents onto their table. Olivia Carter stood behind him, her silence heavy. One rival sneered, "You're burning bridges you'll never rebuild." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice cold as steel. "I'm not here to rebuild. I'm here to bury you." The narrator revealed how the rivals' confidence faltered as Jonathan dismantled their leverage piece by piece, exposing debts, lies, and weak ties. The storm outside pounded against the glass, mirroring the collapse unfolding within. Jonathan's war was no longer hidden. It was public, merciless, and irreversible. The narrator explained how Jonathan returned to his private terrace overlooking the city, rain soaking his suit as he stood in silence. Olivia Carter joined him, her voice trembling. "You've won battles, but at what cost?" Jonathan's eyes locked on the skyline. "Cost means nothing. Survival is all." David Mitchell appeared in the doorway, defeated but bitter. "You've destroyed everyone, Jonathan. Soon, there will be nothing left of you." Jonathan turned slightly, his expression hollow but unyielding. "Then let nothing remain, except my victory." The narrator revealed how lightning cracked the sky above them, as Jonathan's empire burned quietly below. He had chosen to embrace war, and in doing so had begun to destroy himself. The narrator described how the board gathered under storm-filled skies, every executive tense as lightning lit the glass tower. Jonathan Hale entered, his presence like a blade cutting the air. He looked across the table, his voice low but deadly. "This ends tonight." Olivia Carter whispered, "Jonathan, be careful." But he ignored her, eyes locked on David Mitchell, who sat pale yet defiant. David spoke with trembling conviction. "Your empire rots because you rule by fear." Jonathan's reply cracked like thunder. "Fear built it. Fear will defend it." The narrator explained how silence thickened, the storm echoing their fury. The air reeked of betrayal and desperation, and everyone knew only one of them would leave with power intact. The narrator explained how Jonathan slammed evidence onto the table, his voice a whip. "You sold us to vultures, David. You bled us dry." David shot back, "I saved us from you." Olivia Carter rose, her hands trembling. "Stop before this destroys everything." Jonathan ignored her, leaning closer to David. "You wanted war. Now you'll drown in it." The narrator revealed how fear rippled across the boardroom, the storm outside flashing white against the glass. Executives whispered among themselves, torn between the two men. Jonathan's jaw was tight, his eyes wild, his empire teetering. The confrontation had become more than corporate survival. It was a duel of loyalty and vengeance that would decide the company's fate. The narrator described how Jonathan advanced around the table, his eyes burning with fury. David Mitchell rose to meet him, no longer hiding his contempt. "You're not a leader. You're a tyrant," David said bitterly. Jonathan's voice thundered, "Tyrants survive." Olivia Carter stepped between them, pleading, "Jonathan, this isn't strength, it's destruction." Jonathan paused, his breathing ragged, yet his gaze never softened. Only destruction can clear the rot. The narrator revealed how Olivia's words echoed painfully through the chamber, yet Jonathan's silence told the truth. He was too far gone, consumed by rage and betrayal, his final confrontation no longer about business, but about crushing the last enemy standing. The narrator revealed how the storm outside mirrored the chaos inside. Jonathan slammed his fist onto the table, declaring, "I'll bury anyone who stands in my way." David Mitchell answered with venom, "Then bury me, because I won't let you destroy us all." Olivia Carter shouted, her voice breaking, "Enough!" But her words were drowned by thunder. Executives recoiled as the confrontation spiraled, their empire fracturing before their eyes. Jonathan leaned so close to David that their faces nearly touched, his whisper more terrifying than his roar. "You'll regret the day you crossed me." The narrator explained how the boardroom no longer felt like a corporate hall. but a battlefield where survival depended on who struck first. The narrator explained how the climax erupted when Jonathan seized control of the meeting with a single command. "Security," he barked, and guards entered, surrounding David Mitchell. Olivia Carter cried out, "Jonathan, don't do this!" David's face twisted with rage and despair. "You've killed this company, Jonathan. You just don't see it." Jonathan's eyes blazed as he replied, "I killed nothing. I saved it from traitors like you." The narrator described how thunder split the sky, illuminating Jonathan's hollow triumph. He had won the battle, but the cost was written across every face in the room. Trust was dead, loyalty was ashes, and Jonathan Hale stood alone as the storm roared louder than ever. The narrator described how Jonathan Hale sat alone in the boardroom the morning after the storm. The chairs were empty, the screens dark, the silence suffocating. Olivia Carter entered quietly, her face pale. "It's over, Jonathan," she said softly. He didn't look up, only whispered, "Over for them, maybe." His hands trembled on the polished table, the weight of victory crushing him. Olivia stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You won the battle, but you lost everything else." Jonathan finally raised his eyes, empty and cold. Everything else was weak. The narrator revealed how the company still stood, but the cost was carved into his soul. Jonathan Hale had survived, but what remained was only shadow. The narrator explained how Jonathan walked through the operations floor, employees avoiding his gaze. Once whispers had been respect, now they were fear. Olivia Carter followed at a distance, her expression torn. A young assistant tried to meet his eyes, but Jonathan's cold stare sent them shrinking back. He thought, fear keeps them loyal. Yet deep inside, he felt the emptiness growing. Olivia finally whispered, "They don't follow you anymore. They endure you." Jonathan's silence was heavier than words. The narrator revealed how the empire remained intact on the surface, but the heart of it had rotted, hollowed by betrayal, war, and Jonathan's merciless hunger for survival. The narrator described how Jonathan stood in his private office staring out over the skyline. Rain had cleared, but the city glowed in pale gray, lifeless. Olivia Carter entered, her voice breaking. "You've won, Jonathan, but you're alone." He answered flatly, "Alone is safe." She shook her head. "Alone is empty." Jonathan turned, his eyes hollow, his voice devoid of fire. "Empty doesn't betray you." The narrator explained how Olivia's shoulders slumped, realizing she could no longer save him. She left quietly, leaving Jonathan framed against the glass, a man who had crushed every enemy but lost the last pieces of his soul in the process. The narrator explained how Jonathan called a press conference, standing before cameras for the first time since the scandal began. Flashbulbs lit his face as he declared, "The company is stronger than ever." His tone was cold, rehearsed, devoid of warmth. Reporters shouted questions, but he ignored them. Olivia Carter stood behind him, her face stiff, her loyalty now obligation rather than faith. The narrator revealed how the cameras captured Jonathan, not as a savior, but as a tyrant who had won by burning every bridge. Applause was absent, replaced by a hollow silence after the flashes. The empire still had its leader, but its soul was gone. The narrator described how Jonathan returned to his rooftop terrace at night, the city glowing below like fading embers. Olivia Carter appeared in the doorway, watching silently but saying nothing. Jonathan whispered to himself, "Victory means nothing when there's no one left to share it." He lit a cigar, the smoke curling into the night air. For the first time, his shoulders slumped, the weight of survival crushing him. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, as if promising another storm. The narrator revealed how Jonathan Hale stood alone, a man who had defeated every enemy but had nothing left except ashes. His empire survived, but his soul was gone forever.